Hello, welcome to this recorded video on the theme of Beyond the Pandemic, Exploring Social Work Ethics and Values as a Contribution to a New Eco-Social World. I'm Sarah Banks from Durham University, UK, and I'm joined by Lynn Cairns, also from Durham, Anna Sobotjan from Ljubljana, Slovenia, Michelle Shum from Hong Kong Baptist University, Kim Strom from North Carolina, USA, Jane Shears, who's the IFSW Europe Ethics Commissioner, and Maria Jesus Uriz, who's from the Public University of Navarra in Spain. And together we're going to give you a short overview of some research we've been doing recently. We have been organising a series of webinars alongside the International Federation of Social Workers. And we are in fact the Social Work Ethics Research Group who've been working together for some time to look at ethical issues in social work. And we held the webinars in April and May of 2022. And our idea for the webinars developed out of international research on ethical challenges for social workers during COVID-19 that happened in 2020-2021. And we felt that with the added urgency of the climate crisis, we needed to reconsider what matters for people and the planet and how social workers can or should contribute to co-building a new eco-social world, which is the theme of the Global People's Summit. And our research last year showed that social workers were rethinking what counted as ethical practice in a time of crisis. They were working outside normal policies and procedures. They were crossing personal and professional boundaries. They were having to reprioritize needs and develop creative and innovative solutions, often using community resources. So we set up these webinars alongside the regional ethics commissioners in each of the IFSW regions. And we're very grateful to the ethics commissioners for their support in undertaking this work. And we looked at how can the learning from the pandemic be used to tackle other crises, such as those created by climate or political conflict, and what values and ethics we need. New values or reordering of existing values. In social work, we place great stress on human dignity, social justice, but what about ecological justice and earth care? The regional webinars were held in the African continent, across the Asia Pacific area, including separate Farsi and Arab-speaking webinars in Europe and North America. To date, we've not managed to have a Latin America webinar. Between 12 and 30 people were there at each webinar, representing many countries from Malawi to Afghanistan. We had small group work considering a series of questions, and the research group is currently transcribing the recordings and analysing the data. So this presentation draws on some of the emerging themes which are relevant to the summit. Our live panel will draw out more themes and invite further reflections and discussion. And just so you can see the questions we were asking in the webinars, we had three main questions, which was about social workers' ethical challenges and their rethinking of ethical principles. What did they do? What did they do differently? Any positive examples? Asking social workers with their experience of social and environmental conditions, if there's a policy they wanted to change, what would it be? And as a profession, what values, policies and practices would they like to see being adopted as a framework globally and locally in the context of the People's Summit? And finally, we asked for examples of social workers achieving social and environmental transformation. And we had some very, very engaging, lively and thoughtful webinars where lots of ideas and examples came up. What we heard from the people in the webinars across the world was that many of the similar sort of trends were at work, although how they played out were different in different countries and continents. But certainly, as we all know, the pandemic created new needs that weren't there before, for example, home food delivery, it increased existing social problems, including the isolation of older people, highlighted and increased existing inequities. For example, that minority ethnic groups were seen to be suffering most severely from the pandemic, also migrant workers, Indigenous people. It stimulated new ways of tackling these needs and problems. For example, mobilizing community support when social workers weren't available, and digital working when social workers couldn't go out and visit people. It also, above all, provided opportunities to rethink what matters personally, professionally, and in terms of local and global policy. For example, what came across very strongly was the importance of personal communication, whether that was digital or in person, humane responsibility, responding as a person, not just as a professional, and thinking about local and global equity in terms of accessibility to vaccines and healthcare, for example. So we drew out 5 themes for this presentation. One about the ethical challenges during the pandemic, causing a rethinking of ethics. The second was about the fact that there was less bureaucracy during the pandemic, so people could be more creative. The third is about the importance of a holistic approach to practice and life. Fourthly, the idea of extending the concept of justice. And finally, the role of social workers as skilled experts in social protection and sustainable development. So moving on to the first theme about ethical challenges, we've got 3 subsections: self-care, resources, and digital working. And I'll now hand over to Kim, who will talk to us about self-care and resources.
The experience of the COVID pandemic was a shared experience between service users and service providers. And it was a live presence in the work of and conversations of social workers and the folks that they were working with. So even perfunctory meetings involved opportunities to talk about how each other were doing and how each other were affected by the crisis. Self-care also arose from an inadequate employer response. Employers were caught up short, and in terms of the availability of protective equipment for social workers, realistic guidelines, unclear authority about decision-making, and workforce adequacy as people were deemed essential or inessential, dropped in or out, depending on the nature of their family and personal well-being, and also based on employment rules. Workers were balancing their personal and family safety with their values of service and justice and the needs of service users. And literally, these were matters of life and death in terms of the health of workers and their safety, and also the service users who may have been abandoned or stranded or experiencing differentially the loss of their social safety net, and therefore the risks that attend to that. Mental health needs, the relentlessness of change, the unpredictability, the new normal, which felt anything but normal, gave additional attention to mental health needs for service providers and also for service users. And we heard very much in the sessions about the residual effects of the pandemic. We've heard in many regions about the Great Resignation, about people rethinking their ability to meet pre-existing and unrealistic, unsustainable work demands, and whether they want to continue in their chosen careers. We also heard the residual effects of the pandemic created unrelenting work demands, and often the offer of self-care measures, such as yoga and things that might be helpful under normal circumstances, but seemed like superficial self-care measures under excessive case demands and work responsibilities. The pandemic really helped to focus attention to the essence of social work. What are we here for? What are the things that social workers provide that make a difference in people's lives? And how do we help to value those and bring those to the fore when perhaps they might have been obscured in the past through sort of routinization of social work? The pandemic also created informal and localized prioritization of service user needs and decisions on service delivery, the ways that services should be delivered, whether without having to overthink perhaps the pros and cons of those, but really being in the moment, and also being in the moment about support and supervision for each other and for students, social work students who were often left in the lurch during the quarantine times of COVID and agency changes after that. And then in some settings and regions, the pandemic created the opportunity to give explicit attention to each other's needs, to create connections and to check in with each other. And part of this is people knew that they were going through the same event. So the opportunity to say, really, how are you doing? What's going on with your family? How can I be of help to you? Rather than relying on the workplace or some physical place to bring people together, the need for connection superseded that, and people made great efforts to foster their relationships with one another.
I'll now hand over to Maria Jesus, who will talk about digital working.
During the pandemic, the digital working has shown some benefits, but also some disadvantage. In some cases, digital working has been an alternative to solve patients' isolations, because, for example, in some hospitals, they had provided some iPads or different mobile phones applications to help the infected patients to visit their families and relatives virtually. But one of the problems is how to maintain the privacy and how to make a good evaluation using digital devices. When there was not a direct contact with users, confidentiality is not always guaranteed, because sometimes, for example, it was very difficult to find a private place to talk, or it was very difficult also to evaluate the users and also to balance the situations. But the question is also in the future, should digital be used more frequently or not, digital working? So it could be a way to empower service users to use some telematic tools, but to get it, governments should allow people get access to more internet facilities. But also there is a problem, because we should also prevent a possible digital divide that could exclude some users, for example, older people or most vulnerable people. Digital working could be also a challenge to improve internal and interinstitutional coordination. It is need to reflect about how to share information, or, for example, how to redistribute in an institution tasks and functions. And social workers also need more support and more training in digital devices. They need more support with telematic media. And finally, we could also think about a revision of the codes of ethics in relation to technology and networks.
Thank you. I'll now move on to Anna, who will talk about less bureaucracy, more discretion.
Thank you. So another common theme of the webinars was professional discretion. Participants reported that strict rules, especially those that were imposed externally, for example, by governments, have created obstacles to prompt and appropriate responses to real situations and problems in practice. This was particularly relevant and acute in relation to service users' needs, of course, but also in relation to professional communities. For example, a participant from Spain explained that rules created mistrust and problems in collegial relationships in their organization. Nevertheless, the rigor imposed by rules and external authorities did not mean that social workers around the world stopped exercising their professional discretion, which is mandated by the ideas of social justice and human rights. Participants shared how social workers developed creative and innovative new practices in times that created new dilemmas and challenges and urgent and immediate need. So constraints and new ways of working have indeed produced also new solutions. For example, participants from Uganda, Kenya, Malawi, Philippines, and Afghanistan reported on various innovations that social workers have developed within digital ways of working, such as setting up new digital support systems for child protection or communication among practitioners and so on. Participants in the European webinar, for example, also discussed how the new digital tools enabled and strengthened connections between social workers across the countries, creating wider professional circle for exchange and support. Many participants also pointed out that social work is indeed an essential profession and that the privileged expert positions that we hold actually obliges us to respond with discretion and creativity, especially when rules limit professional responses. So participants agreed that the value base and the ethics of the social work profession are and should be the guide to discretion, but also importantly, a tool that enable us to advocate for it. So finally, participants reported also that the pandemic demonstrated that social workers have experience, knowledge, and insight to also propose and provide professional frameworks for rule and policy making, and that we have a responsibility to incorporate into public policy and approaches the lessons that we have from our own professional practice. That is the recognition that people are connected to each other and to their environment, and that we have a mutual responsibility for a future that is focused on social and environmental justice.
Thank you, Anna. We'll now move on to the third theme, which is the importance of an holistic approach. And we're going to look at people and planet more broadly and working with communities on the ground. So over to you, Michelle, for people and the planet.
Yeah, for the theme of the holism, people and the planet, a holistic approach here concerns the human within and also extended parts of human being connecting with the planet. Social workers from different parts of the world advocate for the completeness and the wellness of human being. During the pandemic, the public health was always given with the priority. Other aspects, such as psychosocial well-being of individuals, were often being neglected. The implementation of lockdown and restriction measures changed people's daily routine as well as religious and social rituals. For example, the newlywed couples may not be able to enjoy celebration with families and friends that conventionally have. The prolonged restrict movement also affects individuals' mental health. Those contracted with the coronavirus may still suffer from long COVID symptoms within a year of diagnosis. Some of them may even suffer from depression. Therefore, humans should be viewed as a whole beings that are not only concerned for physical wellness about the medical intervention, but also the psychological well-being as well as the social wellness that which is the expertise of social workers. Second, in addition to the psychosocial aspect, individual as a whole being also situate in an ecological environment that comprises various microsystems which are intertwining. The economic strike brought by the pandemic also caused many social problems. For example, unemployment also affecting individuals, psychosocial well-being gives rise to increasing family conflicts or even domestic violence. All these indicate the interconnection of all elements and aspects in a society, and we are required to balance various aspects, the social, economic, and particularly the psychological aspects when having a policy. In particular, We have to pay attention to the vulnerable and disadvantaged groups to connect various parts of the society. When we implement a policy which is good for public health, normally the vulnerable people are the groups always being neglected, always being taken away from the benefits of a policy. Therefore, the holistic approach also creates a new system involving not only the government as a policy maker, but also the community and the publics, because the community members are the one know the community well. Navigating various systems, coordinating the helping organizations, and allowing different systems to be hear our voice. The holistic way emphasizes the cooperation between the top-down and bottom-up agencies. The last but not least, the environmental impacts should not be neglected while preventing the contraction of the virus. Humans are also parts of the ecosystem, parts of the environment. There are interdependency and interconnectedness between humans and the environment. The balance between various aspects should also include the environmental aspect, which is founded on the philosophy of I am because we are. And this includes all living things in the world.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll now move on to Lynn, talking about working with communities.
So we heard a strong message in many of our discussions about how the pandemic altered not only how, but where social workers were practicing. Especially interesting for contexts like in the United Kingdom, where social workers reflected on how institutionalised the practice has become and how COVID pushed us out of our institutions and our offices to become more community-facing. Our colleagues in Canada reflected on how the pandemic created the opportunity for social workers to be seen by communities and see what social workers are good for, what we're good at, and different ways of reinventing practice to respond to the community's needs. And when social workers were moved out of the offices and institutions, they moved into positions of changing from doing for and doing to communities to opportunities to do with and to do by. There was a lot of reflections on the particular contribution that social workers can play within communities and how their ethics and values and skills can become guiding principles. Also had the real privileges of hearing the different collaborative ways that social workers mobilised themselves into communities, often in already extreme circumstances that were compounded by the pandemic. An example of that was in Afghanistan, where a group of social workers were concerned by the safety of children and began to communicate using WhatsApp. And this has developed into a Child Protection Action Network, which is a really innovative and rapid response to be able to mobilise into communities and is now in every province of Afghanistan. And that was just one example of the many different ways we heard about how social workers mobilised themselves into the communities that they served.
Thank you, Lynn. Reflecting on all the comments made in the webinars and social workers' concern with their values, we began to think about the need to extend the concept of justice. Social workers are particularly focused on social justice, which is about the distribution of wealth, opportunity, privileges in society. But there's also a need to think about contributory justice, how marginalised people might contribute equally to collective understandings of their experiences and have their resources recognised. It's not to say that that isn't happening and social workers don't contribute to that, but it's there and we need to emphasise it within that concept of social justice. The idea of cultural justice was also mentioned, particularly at the North America webinar in the context of Indigenous peoples, and the idea of fairness in relation to cultural and demographic characteristics is particularly important. And of course, following on from the idea of holistic approaches, thinking about ecological justice, going beyond just the human being and thinking of other non-human beings, such as animals, also having rights, for instance, to an adequate habitat. So these are some of the ways in which social workers are beginning to rethink what they mean by justice, going beyond just the traditional concepts of social justice and looking to a broader conception. And I'll now pass on to Jane, who will finish by talking about the role of social workers as skilled experts. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you. So this theme really is regarding social workers as skilled experts in social protection and sustainable development. And we've heard many examples from the presentation so far about how social workers contributed into us developing this theme. So there's 5 main areas here. The first one is poverty, and social workers adopted a solution-focused approach. And we saw examples such as homelessness, food shortages, food poverty particularly, where social workers were involved in mobilising resources to meet the protection of people who are very vulnerable. Our second area in this theme is eco-wisdom, where social workers were very much focused on the environment. And again, we had examples of social workers working with community groups, thinking about different ways to save water, for example, or looking at alternative materials for fuel. The third area is around social worker activism. And we found that in many of the countries, people reported that social work wasn't really valued as a profession. And through examples of social work activity and activism, we found social workers standing up and standing out and showing, yes, that we are part of a critical workforce. In terms of connection, Lynn has already spoken about this in a way, but this was very much about social workers being community focused, connecting in different ways, both with each other, with other professional groups, and between social workers and service users. And we saw examples where new groups or new initiatives were created, different digital connection groups. In one example, we found where social workers were matched with supervisors across different parts of the country and the region. And lastly, around education. And this was very much about social workers thinking about the future education of their own work, their own development, their work with service users, and the future social work community. And we saw really, really good examples, really innovative examples around green social work, where somebody reported on setting up an eco-business with service users. And we also had examples shared by colleagues in Africa, just about different ways of thinking about working with the community in terms of education initiatives. And one of the things we might want to think about for the future is how we ensure the future training of social workers embraces sustainable issues and sustainable development goals.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jane. So thank you very much to all the contributors here, and above all, thanks to all those who participated in the webinars, whose ideas and accounts of their practice we have used to produce this presentation. And we look forward to further discussions with more people across the world. And we are convinced ourselves that social workers do have a very significant part to play as value-based practitioners in co-building a new eco-social world. Thank you very much for listening.